All right, welcome everybody. There were some folks from our stamp club today who weren't able to be here because there's an awful lot going on in the world of college basketball. My favorite team, unfortunately, did not win its conference championship, but it definitely will be in the NCAA. So I've got a break for today. I will be gaining some energy for the end of next week, which I will need because I'm emotionally drained, but that's okay. I wasn't really out on the court. But today we are going to have some fun. We're going to get into embossing paste, and it's really about techniques. I've got a card and a half that I'm going to share with you, but it's really about a couple of different ways to use embossing paste and reinkers and embossing powder and just making some really, really pretty foregrounds for cards and just having some fun. And I'm going to turn the camera over to my work area and I'm going to dive in because the best way to do this is to just do it. And these are a couple of examples that I put together before getting on today. And this shows an example. It's a little hard to see on camera. I can see it much better in person, I think. But this is embossing paste on the left. And there are a couple of green inks that I use. I've got Evening Evergreen and Soft Succulent in here. And we're going to play with the reinkers. But that's one thing we're going to do. And then this will turn into a card. It's actually two pieces at the moment. And this is a piece that was completely Evening Evergreen, and it was beautiful. Embossing paste over the entire front. And the embossing paste in this case was left as white. So what I'm going to do today is I am going to use 3 of the masks that are part of the butterflies and flowers layering decorative masks. This set actually comes with 6 masks, and the other 3 are ones that you use together, kind of like two-step stamping, but these are almost standalone, and there's some really pretty patterns. You can see we're going to do one with the flowers. We're going to do one with these kind of vines, and then another we are going to do with a really pretty elegant pattern that you see there. And I'm going to show you 3 different ways that you can use embossing powder or embossing paste. This is not an extensive or an exhaustive list of ways that you can use the paste. These are just 3 examples, and you're going to come up with more. The first one that I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially mimic, in some respects, creating a piece like this. And I'm going to attach my paper. So I've got a piece of scrap paper behind it. This is a piece of garden green cardstock. And I just cut it down so it's a little bit thinner and a little bit shorter than a quarter sheet of cardstock. And what I want to do, and this is kind of important when you're using embossing paste, you want to try to stabilize your piece of paper a little bit from moving around because we're going to be using a palette and we're going to be putting a paste over it. So we want to stabilize our paper. And we also want to stabilize the stencil. And I'm going to use the word stencil and mask interchangeably. I apologize. In my past, I did a lot of stenciling. And that's why you will hear me say stencil as well as mask. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of tape. You can use glue dots. You can use anything you want. And I'm just going to put a little piece of tape in the middle back of that piece of cardstock. And that way, that's really not going to move around. It also is not going to create an issue. There's not going to be any hump or anything. If you want, you can use a couple of glue dots, and that will also help secure your paper. And then for the stencil or the mask, I'm just going to try and center it. It really doesn't matter on this, but I'm going to try and get it centered. And then what I want to do is I want to put that down so that it will not move. And you have a couple of options. You can use washi tape. So I could take this washi tape and I could tape it right around the edges. That's one option. I could use, this is painter's tape, even though it's the color of masking tape. It's not quite as sticky as masking tape. Or I could use Post-it notes. So any of those are great alternatives. And I'm just going to use a little bit of washi tape. So I'm going to take that washi tape, and because my piece of paper is smaller than the mask, I'm not going to necessarily put tape all the way around. What I'm trying to do here is make sure that that mask is not going to move. So I really don't need to use an awful lot of the washi tape. And I'm just going to put that right down. And then I'm going to get out my embossing paste, because an obvious statement is you're going to need embossing paste for this technique. Now, embossing paste comes in many different forms, and Stampin' Up! Sells two kinds of embossing paste. They come in these tubs that have screw-on caps, and they're nice and airtight. Airtight is important because you don't want your embossing paste to dry out. And Stampin' Up! Has embossing paste that is white, but two different kinds. One white that is a basic matte white. That's the kind that I'm going to be using today. And then the other one has a shimmer to it. They work the same way, so you can use either. When you open up your jar initially, you're going to have not only this piece, which is really good to save and to reuse because it's also going to help you get a nice seal. But you're also going to have a film over the top, and you're just going to take that film off. When I look at this, it reminds me of frosting. And I think as you work with this, you're also going to feel like you are frosting a cake or cupcakes, you know, that whole process. When you're not using your paste, be sure to put the lid back on. You don't have to always squeeze it really tight or push it really tight, but don't let the air get to that. You will not be happy if your paste dries out. One of the other things that you might want to have on standby is a palette knife. And these are the three that are sold together from Stampin' Up! They come in this kind of packaging. And they're kind of nice because there are different angles that you can use. They're different sizes. If you don't have these, don't worry. Grab a plastic knife. And we're basically on your plastic knife, we're going to use the side that is flat. But I'm going to show you some fun things you can do with the serrated side as well. Okay. So I am going to grab this knife palette here. This one is nice and long. I really like it. And we are literally going to just do this. And I will give you some tips and tricks along the way. One other thing that I am going to mention that I have off to the side, and I'm not going to bring this in all the way because I will dump it, is a little dish of warm, right now, won't be soon, warm water, and I put a little bit of dishwashing liquid in it. This you are going to want to have. You're going to want to put your masks into water, soapy water, when you are done using them. And from experience, I can tell you that you truly do want to do that. This paste can dry fairly quickly. And if you allow it to dry in your mask before you put it in the water, it just takes a little bit more to get it out. All right, I am literally going to just dig in and get a glob. We'll call it glob. It looks like a glob of paste to me. And I'm going to put that right down on top of the mask. And then I'm going to put the lid back on the jar. If I need more, I'll come back. When I picked that up, I picked it up on kind of the front of the knife. But now I'm going to use the back. For me, it's easier because I'm going to be pulling this over. It's easier for me to use the back. If I tried to pull it over by using the front, it's not going to go all the way down to the paper. So I want it to go all the way down to the paper without a lot of effort. And I am literally, this is like I am frosting a cake or frosting a cupcake, and I'm just spreading this. And it's the coolest thing. Now you don't need a lot of embossing paste. So what I'm also doing is as I am putting this on, I am scraping it back onto the knife, and I am scraping it down to the top of the mask. So the layer that I'm putting on here is really thin. You don't want it to be really thick. And I'm just scraping it off, and that's giving me more paste on the back of my little palette knife. And then I'm going to be spreading that a little bit further. And I'm just going to go over this and give it kind of a one pass. And if I didn't get enough of the embossing paste to begin with, that's not a problem. I'm going to go back into that jar because I didn't get quite enough, but no issue. And I'm just continuing to put that onto the mask, and then I'm literally scraping the mask and pulling it again right up to the knife, and then I can spread it. It's very, very similar to what you do if you're icing a cake. Where you're going to take that icing, so I'm going to get some more. I don't have quite enough. And just pop what I didn't put onto my mask back in the jar. And I'm going to use the back of that knife again and just spread it out. And I'm looking around at all four sides of the paper to make sure that when I'm looking at the holes in the mask, that I have covered them. And as you do this, you're going to come up with your own way and your own style of using embossing paste, because you may decide that you want to leave some of the holes on the edge blank. You don't want them to be covered. You want it to show as an imperfect design. That's awesome. And I purposely just put a little too much on here because I want to show you that if you did get a little too much out of your jar, don't worry about it. All you need to do is take your knife and scrape up the excess. And that's going to do two things. It's going to spread your paste a little bit further, and it's going to get that excess up so that you can just take it and put it back into your jar. And this way you're not wasting any of that either. So I'm just like frosting, I'm putting it right back into the jar. All right. And I'm, again, just making sure that I like how this is coming out. And I'm good with that. It's not perfect, but it's good. All right, so this knife. Now, a couple things that you can do with a knife. You can stick it into that soapy water that you have off to the side and get it cleaned off. If you have a couple of knives, you can try to keep this one in the weighting. You don't necessarily have to clean it at this point. You might have another knife that you're going to use. I'm taking a wet wipe. You could use a paper towel. You could just dip your knife into that bowl of water that you have to the side and just kind of clean it off. And you do want to try to get that embossing paste off of that knife if you're going to use it again soon. And then for the mask, I'm just going to pull on one of the edges. I'm going to lift up the washi tape and take that off. What I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to get my mask off so that I can put that into the little water that I have over to the side. So I'm just going to peel that mask right off. And you can see that I have the embossing paste on the cardstock. This mask is pretty clean because I did scrape it well, so there's not an awful lot that's on there. And I've got a choice here as well. I can try to wipe off a little bit with the wet wipes. That's not going to do much. You can tell that's really not doing much. So the best thing that I can do with this, and you're not going to see me do it because I'm taking it off camera, I'm just going to put that into the water. I'm pressing it with my fingers so it's going down into the water. And I'm just going to let it soak. And then after I am done with the other masks, I'm going to come back and I will really clean that off well. Now, if you wanted to reuse a mask before you clean it, you can do that. I could take that the one that I just used and I could use it again. I wanted to show you a couple of different designs, so I'm choosing not to do that. And then what I like to do is just pull the edges up. I'm not going to play around with that tape. I'm going to let the tape do its thing, but I'm just pulling the edges up so that there is sort of a freeing of the paste that's on the side. And this one is going to go and dry. Now you do need to let embossing paste dry a little bit. It is going to be a little tacky. If I were to put my finger in there right now, I would get the paste on my finger. So I want to let that dry. And for air drying, I would leave it, if you're not going to force the drying, or we're going to force the drying on another piece, I would leave it for about 15 or 20 minutes. And this one I did yesterday. And you can see it's a different color cardstock, but it will dry really well and it will leave you a very nice finish and a really nice pattern. So that's the basic way to use embossing paste, where you take your mask, you take the paste the way it is in the jar, you spread that over your mask, and then you have a beautiful design underneath. But there are other ways to use embossing paste. And this is where I think a lot of the fun really comes in. And what we're going to do now is we're going to do a project that will include color embossing paste. And also we're just going to do a partial page. So we're not going to cover the entire piece like we did here. We're going to come back with a different design, and we're going to do a partial embossing, and we're going to use multiple colors. If you are going to use the same mask that you did for the first one, go ahead and clean it off, and you can just dry it with paper towel, or if you have a towel, you can go ahead and just dry that as well. And while you're doing that, I'm going to explain a little bit about coloring embossing paste. There are several ways to do this, and I'm going to go through a few of them. I'm going to really focus on two ways that I like to do the coloring. One is that you can take a jar and you can actually put some embossing paste in the jar. You can add a drop or two of your reinker, and then you can blend the two together to color your embossing paste. And we are actually going to do that. I've chosen a couple of colors that I want to use on the example that I'm going to show you. This is a piece of basic white cardstock, and I'm going to put some color embossing paste on them. And I've got polished pink and fresh freesia. And I just thought those two together would be really pretty. So you can do it by putting paste into a jar. And I'm going to grab a jar that I have off to the side. This was one of those little jars that you get samples of. This is probably preserves. And I like this because it's tiny And it also has a really nice seal. I mixed these yesterday. I've mixed colors like this before and put them into these little jars, and they will stay nice and they don't dry out quickly. So I will be able to use these for at least a few weeks, if not longer. So I don't feel like I'm wasting the paste. Now to do that, and let's do the polished pink in this jar. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in. I'm going to grab this knife and I'm going to grab some of that paste and go ahead and put it into the jar.
Lori, what were the colors you used?
I'm using polished pink and fresh freesia. So I'm going to put about that much of the paste into the jar. And then what I suggest is that you go light first as far as amount of the ink that you put in here. So I'm going to do 1 drop. I'm using, this is the polished pink. So I'm just putting in 1 drop of polished pink. And I'm going to use my little palette knife and I'm just going to stir that around. And obviously it's like food coloring, you know, it's the analogy of the frosting and the food coloring, that the more drops of ink you put in here, obviously the darker the color is going to be. And what you can also do, which is kind of fun, is let's say that I wanted to do an ombre look. I could start with my polished pink with just 1 drop of the ink, do part of the design. I could come back and I could put another drop of ink into the same jar to get a little bit stronger pigment. And I could do a little bit more on that design. I'm just going to put this off to the side for a moment. And I would create another deeper polished pink color. And I could continue on the design. So you have a lot of options, just like you do when you are baking. Now, another way to do the coloring of the paste is, this is a silicone mat. And this is a really nice way to mix the paste. And I'll do the fresh freesia and using this technique. I'm going to grab another of my little knives because I just want to have a different color, because I've already got the polished pink on, the one that I just used. And essentially what I'm going to do on here is I'm going to put some of the paste onto my silicone mat, and then I'm going to put a drop of the ink and mix it up. Now, there are pros and cons to this. The pro to it is when I do this, I'm just taking a little bit here, I can very easily mix the paste because I don't have a jar that I'm contending with. You know, like you saw me try to mix that up in that little jar with the lawn palette knife. And it does okay, but it can be a little bit tricky to get in the corners. But the beauty of doing it in the jar is the jar is going to keep my paste nice and dry, or wet, excuse me, it's not going to dry it out. Whereas this, when I mix it up, it does a great job mixing the color, as you can see. And if I wanted it darker, and this looks a little too pinky to me, so I'm going to add just a little bit more color to it. It's going to start to dry out a little faster. But I can always take it and I can put it into a jar, what's left, and then I can seal that up so that I'll be able to use that later. So you can see by adding that one more drop that I'm able to change the color. I'm just getting the paste off the bottom of my knife so that I can put it all together. All right. Remember also, the more ink you put in, the looser the paste is going to be. So that can alter a little bit of the way that the paste behaves. And I'm going to bring in one of the greens as well, because I think these three colors are really going to look really nice together. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take that piece of paper and we're going to set it up in much the same way that we did the other piece, meaning I want to secure this so it is not going to move around a lot when I'm doing the embossing. And I'm going to just take a piece of tape. You can take glue dots, whatever you want to use to just tack this down a little bit. So I'm just putting that onto a scrap piece of paper. And then I'm going to grab my paper so that I've got plenty behind. And I'm not going to put this in a way that it's up, straight or anything like that. I'm going to kind of attach it this way. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did. I'll wash the tape. I just ran out, so I'm going to grab another color. And I'm going to put this mask down. Now on this one, I'm going to purposely put some tape along this edge. And the reason is if I come over here and I do any embossing, I don't want to have that straight line. So I'm trying to make sure that it's sort of a visual cue to me to stay away from that area. And it's also holding the mask down. So it's got a dual purpose, which is awesome. I'm just going to tack that down a little bit. And on this one, I'm also not going to do the whole thing. I'm going to purposely make it look like it's only part of the design. So I'm going to start with this fresh freesia. Doesn't matter what color. And I'm just going to randomly come in and add some color. So this is the fresh freesia. And I'm just like I did before, I'm picking it up and putting it onto the mask. And then I'm going to kind of move it around. And I'm going to scrape it and try to get as much off as I can. And again, this is very random. So just like that. Now I'm going to grab some of the green because I think the green is nice and tight. So let's see, we're going to have to mix up some green. That's fine. And we'll mix up some of the green. So I'm just going to take a little bit more of the paste and put it over here. My jar is very tight in terms of allowing me to get back into that green paste. My husband had to help me open some of the jars yesterday, so be aware that you may need to have a little bit extra muscle. And we're going to put a drop of evening evergreen on this one. Why not, right? All right. And I'm going to mix that right in here. This is a really nice dark green, so I think it will look really pretty between the two kind of pastel colors. And I'm just going to bring some of that over, add that in. I'm doing it fairly randomly. I'm not really overthinking where this is going to go. But just taking some of that paste and adding. What's also nice with this is once it's dry, you can take a piece of paper. I will be able to take this piece and actually put it through my paper trimmer and cut even where the embossing paste is. It will work really well with that. All right, and the third one I have is what is in the jar. This is the polished pink. So I'll take a little bit of that and I'm going to put that. All of these together. And honest to goodness, the more you do this, the more familiar it feels if you have done icing cakes or cupcakes or anything like that. There are a lot of different kinds of embossing paste also that are on the market. There are some that have really heavy metallics in them. And, you can use them to be really sparkly. They also have some that are pre-colored, and you can use those as well. So when I'm pretty okay with the colors, I'm going to do a few things. One is I've got jars that I already have off to the side, and I like this green. I don't want to waste it. So I'm sticking that into a jar. Now, it's kind of up to you, obviously, if you want to do that or you don't want to do that. And it may be that you think that's a little crazy, but that one's all set. And then I'll do the same with that in just a minute. But what I like to do when I am done with this particular piece, and I've done all the spreading of the embossing paste, I'm going to intentionally kind of mix these together. And what I'm doing is I'm just going to start on one end and I'm scraping this off again. Because I'm mixing the colors, I'm not going to save that embossing paste. It is going to be just a muddy mess when I'm done because I've combined those three colors. But I want to get off as much of that embossing paste as I can because I want it to be kind of thin. And I'm just going to scrape that off. And obviously that's going to go in the trash. And then just like I did on the other piece, I'm going to take off my washi tape. It's like revealing a work of art and you have no idea what it's going to look like until you lift everything up. I'm just taking off those pieces of washi. And then I'm going to go ahead and lift up the mask and pull that off. And I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to put this one, because I'm going to use the third mask, I'm going to put this into my little bin of water over to the side. So as you can see here, if you don't intentionally use the entire mask, you are bound to have little itty bitty pieces that are going to show up. I like this. I like the fact that it is not intentional, that it is very kind of sporadic. I also like how the colors blend, and there are endless possibilities in terms of how you would blend. You could do a rainbow color. You could do the ombre like we were talking about a couple minutes ago. And what's nice about this is when it dries, this will act like a piece of paper. So you can go in and you can cut it, you can tear it. And that's what I did with this piece when I made this card. There are actually two cards that I ended up with that came from one piece that I did with that mask. You can tell I used this is Evening Evergreen cardstock. And then in the embossing paste, I used Evening Evergreen and Soft Succulent. And I just mixed those two. I allowed that piece to dry. And then I tore it. And when I tore it, the embossing paste did a really nice job of sticking to the paper. So it almost becomes part of the paper, and you can cut, you can tear, you can do whatever you want to with it. And it just gives a really cool kind of background. So before I move on, I'm going to do just a little bit of cleanup. And again, taking that wet wipe. And for the plastic palette knives, I can get away with using this wet wipe to clean off the embossing paste. And I'm going to save this one more time because I want to show you the third way of doing a technique. with this. And again, you're going to come up with many, many more. I'm going to go ahead and just clean off a little bit on this knife. And I'm going to chuck this one into the water that I have over to the side because I want that to get nice and clean as well. And then I'm conservative, you know that, so I'm going to try and save some of this paste. And I have one more little jar that I've got off to the side, and I'm going to kind of scrape that and put that back in. Now, there's not an awful lot of paste in here, I will grant you that. So you should not feel bad. If you get to this point and you've got this much left, you probably think I'm crazy for even saving it, and you could definitely chuck it if you wanted to. This knife, I'm going to go ahead and put that into my little water bowl. And this I'm going to bring off camera, and I'm also going to stick that into the water. What's really nice about the silicone is that it won't stain. So the ink that I put on here is not going to stain the silicone, and that paste is going to come off as well. It will take a little bit of condensing and water, but it will come off and it will be nice and clean for the next time that you want to use it. So that is over off camera, kind of hanging out in some soapy water, just getting all nice and happy. So that's the second technique. Now, the third technique that I want to show you involves embossing powder and embossing paste. I'm going to put this one off to the side as well, the one that we just did. We're going to come back to these in just a few minutes. The first one that we did is still off and it is drying. Here's the first one. Here's the second one. And now we're going to talk about the third one. And what I'm going to use for the third one is the third mask that I had mentioned that comes in that set. And we are going to be adding some metallic embossing powder. I've got gold embossing powder and I have some silver embossing powder. And I am going to be adding a little bit of both to this. Now, I also have my heat gun off to the side, and I will be using that in just a few minutes. And I could have used the heat gun on the first two pieces that I did, but I obviously chose not to do that. But you can definitely use the heat gun to speed up the drying process if you want to. Obviously, with the embossing powder, we're going to need to use the heat gun. All right, for this one, the prep is pretty much the same, but I'm going to do one thing a little bit differently. So this is the piece, this is a navy blue. And because when I do the heat gun setting, I want to have a part of the paper to hold, right? I don't want to have the embossing paste all over the piece because then there's no way for me to hold this and hold the heat gun and have it do what it needs to do without burning my fingers. So I need to create a little bit of a border around the side in order to be able to do that, in order to hold it. So here's how we're going to do that. I am going to prep this exactly like I did the other two, meaning I'm going to secure that piece of cardstock. I'm just going to get, again, I'm using tape just because it's easier to get to. Put that in the middle on the back. Put that on my piece of paper. Now, what I want to do is I want to have a border around the sides. That means that I need to put whatever it is that I'm going to use to hold this down. I need to kind of have a line. I'm going to use this painter's tape because it's going to help put a line, a straight line, straight as I can get. I will be able to cut this piece, but to start with, don't want it straight. It will just make life a little bit easier. And I grabbed a piece that is a little bit longer than the stencil. And I'm just going to try to put that a little bit over my stencil so that I will have extra. There's a little bit of the cardstock that's underneath that painter's tape, and I'm doing that intentionally. I want to have something to hold when I use the heat gun. I'm going to do the same thing on all four sides. So this is painter's tape, and I'm purposely going over the edge just a little bit so that I'll have something to hold on to. And I'm going to do that on all four sides. And I'm also trying to keep this flat. And if you find that it's kind of buckling up a little bit, you can adjust it and just try to make that stencil as flat as you can get it. That way your paste is going to go on nice and flat and smooth. And put a couple more pieces. So taking that tape and just a little bit over the edge. And then one more side. And put that a little bit over the edge of the cardstock as well. All right, so now I have everything set to go. And for this, I am not using colored embossing paste. I'm going to use the white embossing paste. The actual metal from the embossing powder is going to add the color. So just like we did the first time, and I am going to put it all over, like I'm frosting the top of a cake. So I'm going to come in and grab some of that paste, put it right on the top. I'm going to take 2 seconds to put this lid back on. And then I'm going to go ahead and start spreading this. And just like I did the first time, I'm going to scrape and respread, and scrape it and respread. And I'm just trying to get a nice thin coating. Like I've said many times already, you don't need a lot of embossing paste on this. You're just putting a coating down, and the thickness of the mask is really going to almost dictate how much embossing paste you need, because as you scrape the top of the mask, you're taking the paste off, and it's going to be the thickness of the mask when you scrape it off. So I'm just scraping it up and reusing it and filling in where I don't have any paste. And then I'll come back and I'll look and see, are there holes? On this one, I'm definitely going to need to go back into the jar and get a little bit more paste to use. Almost at the end here. Actually, I may not need more paste. We'll see. So scraping off the excess and then coming back and filling in where those holes are. It doesn't look like I'm going to need that. I'm really paying close attention to make sure that I have all those holes filled. And scraping as I go. And you can see as I'm doing that, I'm still collecting some of the paste on the bottom that I can respread if I need to. So it really is a very thin film that I'm putting down. And that's looking pretty good. And then if I have enough left, and yes I do, I can go ahead and open my jar back up and just put that back in. And that way I'll have a little bit more to use later. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the masking tape off, or the painter's tape, and I'm looking at, I can tell what piece of tape is on the top. And I want to obviously take that piece off first. Get this palette knife out of the way. And turn this, and I can see that, let's see, this one is going to be one of the next ones that I'm going to take off. So I'm just peeling up the tape on the edges and revealing the paste underneath. And some people will reuse the tape. I'm not going to. I'm going to actually just toss it because it has paste on it. And we've got one more side to take off. All right. And then if I lift up the mask, I've got a really pretty design underneath, as you can see. Now this is wet. I don't want to touch that paste. I'm essentially done right now with this. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that into my little vat of water over to the side. And I'm going to concentrate on the piece that I have. Now I do want to lift this up. So I'm going behind. I'm just lifting it off of the tape. I'm going to take the tape off and I'm going to get rid of all of this. I'm done with all of this. So what I need is I need my piece that has the embossing paste. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some embossing powder. Now, like I said, I have two colors. I have a silver and I have a gold. And I have them in these little plastic bins. And what I'm going to do is I've got my pretty dandy spoon and I am randomly sprinkling embossing powder on this. I'm not covering all the areas. This is silver. I want this to be multiple colors of metal. So I'm just kind of randomly putting on the silver and then I'm just tipping it over and popping it out. And then I'm going to come back in. So I'm going to get rid of that silver. I'm going to come back in with my gold. And what I want to do on this is I want to fill in the areas where I did not put the silver. I want to add some gold embossing powder to those areas. And you don't need to be super careful if you mix the colors in here. It's fine because they're going to look mixed anyhow, you know, when we get done with the heating. So I'm just sprinkling where I see that there are openings in color. And I'm going to go ahead and tap that off. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So again, I'm just sort of filling in where I don't see any gold or silver. And every time you do this, you're going to get a very different look and feel. And what's really kind of fun is since the embossing paste is still wet, it really does a phenomenal job attracting the embossing powder. And also it blows my mind, but you don't need to worry about using an embossing buddy. At least I haven't found that you do, because the embossing paste almost takes the static away. So what I have done here is I've added those metallic powders. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the powders out of the way because I'm going to bring in a heat gun. And I'm going to heat this up just a tad. I do want to say that you want to be careful when you are melting embossing powders on top of embossing paste. You do not want to overheat the paste. The best way to gauge when you're doing this, if you're done, is to look at the powder. Look at when the powder starts to melt and move on. If you stay in one place and you continue to heat after that powder has melted, you may start to melt the paste and you're going to see it bubble. So just be a little careful. I'm going to go ahead and bring in the heat gun. I apologize for the noise. And I'm going to hold it at about the same distance that I normally would. And I'm looking at when that embossing powder starts to melt, and I can see it's melting. And I don't want to hold my gun there much longer because I don't want it to overheat. And when you're doing this, be very, very intentional. Don't randomly take your heat gun and go across the page. Go in one spot, then move to the next, then move to the next. Don't do it randomly because that's when you really are going to overheat and cause some problems. And I'm going to put this down and continue. And I think you can see how that is just turning into an absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous card front. When I pull this away and get a chance to look and see how it all comes together, it's really amazing. I'm not sure that the camera is doing it justice because what's going on is the metallic colors pop like crazy. They are really, really gorgeous. I'm trying not to go over the same place that I've already gone over once. Make sure that I have everything here. Looks like I do. So I'm not sure if you can see how absolutely stunning that is, but it just brings out those metals in such an amazing, amazing way. And I think right in here, I can do just a tad more. So I'm just gonna come back in really quick, trying not to overheat it. These kinds of fronts would be gorgeous on wedding cards, on anniversary cards, just really elegant cards. So before I do too much, I'm going to say that I am done. And by mixing those metals, let's see if I can really hold this up so you can see that it is just absolutely gorgeous, just gorgeous. So I'm not quite done because I do want to show you a couple more quick things. But so far we've talked about 3 different ways that you can use these masks. I'm going to come back into the first one that I did, which is the one that did the full mask. And this is pretty dry. You're going to get a really good feeling when you touch the pieces that have the embossing paste on them as far as whether they're dry or not. And it's kind of crazy, but when you touch the back, it will almost feel wet if it's still drying. And obviously you can just touch the front. This one's getting there. It's not quite dry yet, but it's definitely on its way. And then the other piece that we did that had the colors, that one actually feels pretty dry. So this one is definitely good enough that I can take it off the backing. I'm going to take a piece of tape off as well. So we've done a full sheet. Get the tape off the back of here. A full sheet, ones that have different colors of embossing paste, and then they're really super cool, fun embossing with the embossing powder. Now, if you don't have masks that have been pre-made, no biggie. You can make your own. You can use dies, you can use punches, you can make them out of window sheets, acetate, you can create your own designs. The one thing that I do recommend is that they're not really flimsy, they're not super detailed in design because then they get a little challenging. You can also make them out of cardstock. If you do that, I strongly recommend that you use white cardstock for your stencils or your masks. I've experimented with this and I used one that was a piece of color cardstock And when I started pulling the embossing paste over that cardstock, some of the ink came into the embossing paste and it changed the color. It was not what I wanted it to be. So use white when you're doing that. Also, if you don't have these palette knives, like I've already mentioned, don't worry about it. A knife like this, a plain old plastic knife with serration, can be super, super fun. Let's look. I'm just going to take a random piece of cardstock. This is one that you can see as a die cut circle. And I'm just going to put a little bit of embossing powder paste on top of this. I'm going to use my knife. So if I come in and I grab a little bit of embossing paste and I just put it on top of this circle, as crazy as this may sound and look, you can use that serrated part of your knife for some cool designs. If you take this piece and you literally spread that paste around, and I'm trying to use the part that is the straight edge on the back, and then take the serrated part and just run it through, you get a really cool wavy line. You can run it the other way, and you can create your own fun designs. I can let that dry. I can make that be part of my design. I can also use the serration when I'm going over a stencil. So for example, if I had used the serrated edge when I was going over the stencil that made this pattern, there would be really cool lines on those flower petals, and it would go all the way across. It would be really, really pretty. Could have done the same thing over here before I added the embossing powder. I could have used that serrated edge and had some really funky lines going on in here. So don't be limited believing that you have to have, you know, the quote unquote appropriate tools. You don't. You can make your own, and you can have just as much fun creating these designs. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is play. Get some of this. Play. Enjoy. You will feel like you're back in kindergarten. And the designs that you create, the different color combinations, the different techniques will enable you to make a lot of just beautiful card fronts that you can use on some really fun projects. And this paste will last quite a bit. I had some in my closet. This is the older version of the Stampin' Up! Paste. It's just in a different container. This, honest to goodness, is, I'm going to say 2 or 3 years old, and that's probably being conservative. I got this out yesterday. It's still fine. And it's fine because I left it in the plastic bag that it came in, and I had it nice and sealed, but it was open. So as long as you're careful with this, it will last. And there's quite a bit that you can play with. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you try it and have fun. It's just a fun thing to play around with.